Join James Tambalebi for Ask the Expert.
Hello and welcome to the program Ask the Expert with me, James Tambalebi. Today's program will focus on the topic climate change. My understanding of the concept is limited to the idea that climate change occurs when changes in the Earth's climate system results in new weather patterns that last for at least a few decades and maybe for millions of years. But for a detailed understanding of this topic, I have with me Dr. Renal Johnson, Senior Lecturer, Department of Geography, Frabe College, University of Sierra Leone. Welcome to the program. Doc, let's start with an expert definition of the concept climate change.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. In terms of an expert definition of climate change, as a concept, there are normally two types of definition. But the definition which I'm going to give you is the definition which was approved by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which we normally refer to as IPCC, which is a combination of scientists from all over the world, social sciences, physical sciences, and so on and so forth, that came together after the issue of climate change came to the fore. And this definition is as follows. It says that climate change is defined as a change of climate, which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activities that alter the composition of the global atmosphere, and which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over comparable time periods. So in effect, what the definition is saying is that climate change can easily be defined as a change of climate due to human interference. But here I must emphasize the aspects of the human interference, because it's the human interference that has brought all these thoughts about climate change, their implications, their impact, and the issues of vulnerability for which many of our countries now accede to.
You made mention of, in your definition, you made mention of direct and indirect activities. What are those direct activities and what are those indirect activities?
Well, in terms of direct activities, we are thinking about things like deforestation, which reduces the sink for the absorption of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. From indirect, we are also looking at the issues of the burning of fossil fuel, which emits...
And when you say fossil fuel, what do you mean?
Well, we mean fuel that has basically been in the form of, they are normally in the form of oil and gas, which we extract from deep coastal areas. And basically why we refer to them as fossil fuel, because fossils basically are the remains of dead plants and animals which have remained for a long time underneath the earth, specifically around the coastal areas, and has undergone a long period of fermentation and has transformed from that particular kind of state into organic material, which is now in the form of oil and gas.
Okay, let's move on to another definition, this time global warming. How will you define global warming, and what's the nexus, if any, between climate change and global warming?
Well, global warming simply means an increase in the ambient temperature of the earth, basically that can result in the issue of climate change. The issue of global warming actually stems from a concept which is known as the greenhouse gas concept. What do we mean by that? The Earth's atmosphere is acting like more or less it is receiving what we call irradiation from the sun. And when it receives this radiation from the sun, it absorbs this radiation and then re-emits this radiation back out into space. But then the atmosphere, the blanket, the atmosphere itself acts as a blanket that impedes actually the emission of these gases direct back into outer space, and therefore creates a kind of blanket that allows the warming of the planet itself, the globe itself. And that is why the name comes from the word globe, global warming. That is world warming as a result of this back emission of this infrared radiation from the sun, and which is being trapped by this blanket of gases in the atmosphere. Now, what actually causes this warming is that the gases in the atmosphere, as I said earlier on, emitted from our own activities, right? That is direct and indirect activities, actually traps this infrared infrared radiation and increases the ambient temperature of the Earth. It is this increase in temperature that one refers to as global warming. Now, what's the nexus between this global warming and the climate change? Now, again, it is something that we have to simplify in terms of the explanation. Now, let us assume that you, Mr. Leby, you go to the hospital and you are feeling sick, all right? And then you go to the doctor. The first thing that the doctor does is to find out what is causing, for example, your status, your situation as a sick man, right? And there are certain parameters that he needs to take cognizance of. For example, he takes cognizance of your blood pressure, takes cognizance of your temperature, right? Now, if your temperature exceeds a certain threshold, then he will conclude that you are sick. Right? It's the same thing. If you look at the atmosphere as a human being, as a living organism, what happens is that when that temperature exceeds a particular threshold, it now allows the globe, the atmosphere, to be sick. It is sick in the sense that it changes the normal pattern of behavior of the atmosphere in terms of two major factors: the weather and the climate. You will recall that from your primary days geography, that weather is the day-to-day variation of weather elements in the atmosphere, whilst climate is the long-term average of weather. So basically, when we talk about weather, we are talking, for example, that at this point in time, let us say the weather is hot, right? In the next few hours, probably it might rain. So that's a change in scene. But when we talk about climate, it is simply slightly more stable. We can say, for example, that Sierra Leone has a tropical climate because why? The temperature of the tropical climatic system is stable, let us say around 29 degrees Celsius or even up to 30 degrees Celsius as the case may be. So now in the terms of global warming and climate change, what happens is that the global warming changes this pattern, this norm of climate stability, and therefore causes the climate change. And so the climate becomes very, very erratic. You can have a frequency of storms, you can have dry spells, you can have an onset of extreme weather, probably very cold weather or very hot weather as the case may be. These are all indications of climate change as a result of global warming.
You are listening to Ask the Expert with me, James Leby, and we are looking at the concept climate change. And my expert is Dr. Reynold Johnson, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Geography, Farabi College, University of Sierra Leone. Doc, let's move now to the signs, or if you like, indications of climate change.
Well, as I said earlier, the signs and indication of climate change is a departure from the norm, a departure from the normal, if I could use that word. Now, I mean, for example, if you have extreme weather, right, you have very, very heavy torrential rainfall, which we have not been experiencing, for example, in Sierra Leone a very, very long time. Or you have a change in climatic patterns or weather patterns, to be a little bit more accurate. For example, during this month of March, you could call that, to be specific, we had the first rainfall on the 27th of March, and then we had another one on the 1st of April, to be specific for Freetown. These are little indications of climate change. Sometimes you can connote it as climate variation, that is a change or departure from the weather patterns itself. But sometimes again it can give an indication of a change of climate because some people might say that it is unusual. Or again, you might have a long period of dry spells. If you could recall last year, everybody was clamoring about the problems we were having about water availability in Freetown as a result of the long dry spell which we had. The rain started around almost at the end of May, as the case may be, and the people in Freetown started suffering from water shortage. That again could be an indication of climate change. Or let's say an issue of extreme event, like what happened on the 17th of August, 2 years back, when we had this mudslide at Motomé at Regent. Again, that could be an indication of climate change. So what we are looking at when we talk about signs and indications of climate change is that a departure from the normal trend which we have always been observing, that is what we refer as signs of climate change in terms of extreme weather.
Okay, let's move now to the factors responsible for climate change or weather pattern. What are those factors?
Well, basically, we have to come back to the definition. The definition says basically we can attribute climate change to human intervention with the climate system in addition to the natural variability of the climate or the weather, as the case may be. So if we go back to that, we can say, for example, if we look at the climate intervention and we look at the human intervention with the climate system, we can say, what are these human interventions? What are these factors? And let us try and see whether we can elucidate them. The first one we can think about is deforestation. Why would we think about deforestation? We would think about deforestation because if we say climate change is hinged on emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, then, and one of the precursor gases or the major gases that are responsible for climate change is carbon dioxide, then what absorbs the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? What removes the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? It's the natural vegetation, which we refer to as the sink. So if you destroy the sink, it means a major part of the sink, which is the forest, it means that that's one of the major factors responsible for climate change. The second is the way in which we use our fossil fuel. Because, for example, now the world over is clamoring for green development, clamoring for a switch from, let me say, conventional energy to renewable energy. Why? Because when we use fossil fuel and we burn fossil fuel, we emit most of these gases into the atmosphere that's responsible for the global warming and subsequently climate change. And therefore, if we switch the usage of this conventional fossil fuel based these fossil fuels, if we switch from the renewables from non-renewables to the renewables, and then what happens is that we'll be able to reduce the issue of climate change. And so the second factor is the use of fossil fuel. The third factor, again, is sometimes ascribed to pollution. Pollution in the sense that, particularly in the oceans and our seas. Now, we do recognize that also plants are not only on the surface of the earth, not only on the land, but they are also in the sea and in the oceans. For example, the biologists will tell you about the planktons, which are minute plants in the ocean. Now, all of these they absorb also carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Right now, so if you pollute the oceans and you pollute the seas, it means that you are incapacitating them from carrying out their sacred duty of absorbing the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which means again pollution is a factor. And also don't forget that the oceans also sequester or they absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And if the carbon dioxide is excess in the atmosphere, it leads to another phenomenon in the oceans, which is referred to as ocean acidification. And that might lead, for example, to the proliferation of unwanted weeds like seaweeds in the ocean. It can also affect the aspect of fishing, migration of fish from one area to another, and a lot of unpredictable outcomes. So these are basically the factors responsible for climate change from the human dimension perspective.
Let's move on now to the effects of climate change on one, human beings, and second, animals.
For human beings, it is multifaceted because we probably will have to look at it on a sector basis. Let us take, for example, the effects of climate change on health. Now, there are many viruses and whatever you call them that are in the earth that they are climate sensitive. For example, you may notice that at the start or almost the end of the dry season, you might notice a proliferation of grasshoppers, okay? Because they are controlled by temperature. When the temperature rises, it allows them to breed and it allows them to migrate, and then you find out that they will proliferate. You take, for example, mosquitoes, right? Mosquitoes are also dependent on climate. The higher the temperature, the more the mosquitoes proliferate, and therefore that is why that's the reason why, for example, if you go to temperate countries, you go to temperate areas, you hardly find the kind of mosquitoes which we have in the tropical region. While in fact, the tropical region, a country like Sierra Leone in the olden days, the historians will tell you that it was called the white man's grave because the mosquitoes caused malaria, which was killing the white people, and so on and so forth. So that again is another issue. Now, when the emergence of certain diseases might be also related to climate change, and particularly temperature variations, which affect many organisms and human beings. Now, well, let's come to another effect of climate change on human beings and animals, right? Now, climate change on humans can also be well, one can feel it in terms of agricultural production, right? There are areas where the drier areas as a result of climate change will not be very feasible for agricultural purposes and agricultural production, right? And also the yield in terms of production for agricultural crops might also decline as a result of climate change, or it can be enhanced also as a result of climate change from the other spectrum, when you consider that probably climate change might enhance more rainfall, or it can enhance drought situation. It depends on what the trend what the trend is. So in cases where we look at the negative side of the spectrum, for example, in terms of drought, in terms of other factors, would say that it will have a negative impact on agriculture, which indirectly impinges on us as human beings. It's the same thing for all other animals belonging to the species of living organisms.
Okay, breathtaking. Let's move on to the relationship between climate change and biodiversity. Is there any connection?
Of course, there's a connection between climate change and biodiversity, because I'm going back to the definition of human intervention with the climate system. And you know, the climate system encompasses not only the atmosphere, it also encompasses the land, it also encompasses the forest, what we call the land, the forest, the sea, and so on and so forth. And don't forget also that all of these climate systems, they are all related together. If we go back to 1992, when the Rio Convention, the United Nations Convention on Environment and Development, took place in Rio de Janeiro, a lot of conventions were tabled. Some of these conventions were as follows. You had the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, which we now refer to as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, and you had the United Nations Convention on Biodiversity to protect biodiversity, which is UNCBD, and then you have the United Nations Convention on to combat desertification, which is UNCCD, and you also have the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and another host of these conventions. Some of them are tabled for signing and ratification. Now, which means that the issue of biodiversity is closely also linked with climate change, because if it's a human intervention of the climate system as a direct, it means that, for example, if you carry out deforestation, it means that you are destroying already the habitat for biodiversity, which biodiversity simply means the diversity of plants and animals. Right, so that's the nexus between climate change and biodiversity. And of course, there's also a nexus between climate change, not only biodiversity, but between climate change and desertification, and climate change and also in terms of...
so can you elaborate on the connection between climate change and desertification?
Well, very long ago, even the Sahara Desert was considered to be a place that was formerly many, well, I could say in terms of geological time frame, millions of years ago, was probably was a forested area. But then, as a result of human intervention of consistent deforestation and clearing, the area has become a desert, which means that, for example, if there is a consistent clearing of forest over a very long period of time, even probably beyond our own period of existence, let us say in the next 100, 200, or 300, even up to a million years from now, we would expect that the desert would be shifting southwards towards the areas where deforestation becomes rampant. And that is why there's this nexus between climate change and deforestation, because deforestation, what we call desertification, is linked with prolonged period of deforestation, and hence prolonged period of drought where we don't have rainfall in those areas. Because why deforestation is linked with desertification and drought? When you clear the surface vegetation, you allow the radiation from the sun to impinge directly upon the surface of the earth, and this increases the level of evaporation. And the level of evaporation can be so strong that what you have is that you have a dry surface for over a long period of time. And as a result of that, you can have this issue of desertification and also the issue of climate change. They are all interlinked, and they are all very intrinsically linked together. It is a concept that you cannot divorce one from the other.
Okay, let's move to another probably similar connections. Climate change and farming or agriculture in the mechanized sense.
Well, again, you see, whatever we do on the surface of the earth, right, even in terms of our livelihood strategies, we are incipiently, basically, causing a change in climate. So let us talk, for example, about mechanized farming and agriculture. Yes, in our quest to improve food production, food availability, productivity, and so on and so forth, we probably, and efficiency in our agricultural system, sometimes there's this trend to move away from the manual hoe and what they call it, slash and burn method to mechanized farming, as the case may be. But in the case of mechanized farming, of course, it not only increases the acreage, but it also increases the level of deforestation, and it also can churn the soil, bring up dust into the atmosphere, which can change the what we normally refer to as the radiation characteristics of the atmosphere, as the case may be. But again, let us not forget that as we progress in our quest for development, we would also need to have what we call palliatives in place. That is, measures to which we can use to reverse the negative trends that most of our development strides basically might cause, and that is the issue of rehabilitation. So in terms of mechanized farming, I'm sure there are agricultural practices which you can use to curb the aspects of deforestation and the aspects of agriculture that may have negative effects of climate change on climate change. For example, you have the concept of climate smart agriculture. That again is a whole area of discussion and debate, which probably I'm not too sure we'll be able to get into at this point in time.
From what you've explained, it's that mechanized farming or agriculture can affect climate change.
Yes, it can affect climate
But you can also say that climate change affects mechanized farming.
Yeah, basically.
So it's a chicken and egg situation,
Exactly.
or which one is the prime mover of the two?
Well, basically, if in terms of human intervention, I think the prime mover of the two is the mechanized agriculture, which would affect the climate change. But at the same time, the climate itself will fight back in order to restore its normal situation. But that can take a lot of time, and it's because of that time scale between the readjustment of the climate to human activities that is why human beings are very much concerned about climate change at this point in time. But nonetheless, it depends on what you prioritize and how you fight the effects of what your prioritization is.
So in practical terms, what does climate change do?
Climate change affects everyone in a negative way, basically. One, as I said, climate change will affect all sectors of our economy. It affects agriculture. It affects health. It affects even transportation. It affects settlements. So the change of climate can negatively affect the development of any nation in terms of the disasters that climate change is likely to cause. Because don't forget, climate change is also associated with the occurrence and recurrence of natural disasters. And therefore, in that light, climate change can do harm, but at the same time, let us not just exemplify the harm. In some cases, climate change can be good, because, for example, in one area of the earth, you might have, let me say, a situation of drought, of long periods of no rainfall. Right, but in another area, you might have an area and a situation wherein you have excess rainfall. Both of the two are evils. Which one do we choose? It depends on how the climate will affect us.
Perhaps finally, as an expert in this field, how can we mitigate the impact of climate change on societies and countries as a whole?
Well, mitigation is the way that has been suggested. That is, one, mitigation in scientifically means a reduction of the sources of the emission of greenhouse gases, which are the prime movers of climate change. And how do we reduce that? We either reduce back by switching from a non-renewable source of energy to renewable source of energy. That is why people are now talking about the proliferation of electric cars, for example, to reduce our dependency on petrol, diesel, and so on. In some countries, they've banned ban the use of diesel vehicles. In other countries, they are switching not only to battery charged vehicles, they are also switching on to electric cars, as I said earlier on. And when we talk about that is in order to reduce the sources of this emission of greenhouse gases. In countries like ours, we are propagating the restoration of our forest through afforestation and reforestation drives in order to increase the sinks to remove the greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. We are also clamoring about the cleaning of our beaches and reduction of waste that we discharge into various areas, be it on land or be it in the sea, as the case may be. And we are also looking at other technological options whereby if the private sector comes in and invests in areas where we make use of more fossil fuel to reduce the dependency on fossil fuel, that will also be a good thing. Agriculture has many other ways in which you can reduce, for example, the impact of climate change. Like, for example, in the past we used to move people from the uplands down to the lowlands so that the aspect of deforestation is reduced, and people use
and when you say lowlands, you're talking about swamp farming,
the bully lands, and so on and so forth. These are all measures that people can use in various sectors. For example, again, when we talk about climate change in the health sector, we have this proliferation of bed nests to reduce the incidence of malaria. You have also the issue of looking at the morning skin, the emergence of new diseases, which is also important, which can be a precursor to the change of climate. These are all sector-specific, as the case may be, and there are sector-specific measures which you can use to reduce the sources, basically, of the emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which is key in terms of climate modification.
Thanks for talking to me, Dr. Johnson.
And thank you to Mr. Levy for your patience.
You've been listening to Ask the Expert with me, James Tambalebi, and the subject of discussion was climate change. And I had as my expert Dr. Ronald Johnson, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Geography, Forabi College, University of Sierra Leone. Keep listening.
Tune into Radio Mount Orel, FM 107.3 every Monday after the 8 p.m. news bulletin and on Saturdays after the 7 a.m. news bulletin for Ask the Expert.